Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome to the second video lesson for physics online learning. Last time we learned about free fall, the forces of gravity, and acceleration due to gravity. Today we are going to learn about air resistance. So in the screen, you can see the lesson objectives for this lesson. So at the end of this lesson, what you should be able to is you should be able to know what is air resistance, and air resistance is a force, and it always opposes the motion of objects in an atmosphere. Objective number 2, you need to know the factors that affect air resistance. So there are 4 factors: speed, surface area, shape, and the density of air. So we'll talk more about that later. Let's start. Air resistance. So what is air resistance? Air resistance is a type of force that you can feel when you are in air. It's a type of force that opposes motion. In other words, when you are going through air, especially you are going through a very fast speed, you will feel air pushing back against you, and this force caused by the air pushing back against you, or the resistance coming from the air, is what we call air resistance. Number 1, walking through water is hard because it offers resistance to our motion. So you have experienced this before, especially when you are swimming or when you are in a pool. When you are walking through water, you can feel it's very hard to walk through water. The water is resisting your movement. So similar to water, air behaves in a similar way. So when you are walking through air or run, especially when you are walking quite quickly or running quite quickly, you can feel the air pushing back against you. Okay, maybe not so much as walking, but when you are running or when you are in a car or when there is a strong wind, you can feel the air pushing back against you. Number 2, so air, like I said, air behaves in a similar manner to water and produce air resistance. This can be felt when running very fast, when putting a hand through an open car window, or in the form of wind blowing onto us. Where does air resistance come from? So air resistance comes from air particles hitting through us as we move against them. So let me explain. So air resistance comes from the air particles. So imagine, so these black dots, these are the air particles that I've drawn here. And on the left side here, this is you. So imagine you are, let's say you are running, right? So when you are running, you are walking through the air particles and you can feel the air particles colliding onto your skin or onto your body. So when that happens, each of these air particles are exerting a force on your body, and therefore you can feel the air particles pushing back against you. So if you have 1 or 2 air particles hitting back against you, you don't feel much because they are very tiny, and the force exerted on you by these tiny air particles are very small, so you don't feel much. But you it gets stronger the more air particles are hitting against your body. Another example of air resistance can be felt when there is wind. So when there is wind, each of these air particles are moving towards your body, and you can really feel them hitting on your body, and you can really feel that force coming from the air. The thing that you need to know about air resistance is air resistance always opposes your motion. So if you are moving forwards, air resistance will be opposing your motion. So air resistance will be backwards. If you are moving backwards, air resistance will want to oppose your motion. So therefore, air resistance will be in the direction opposite to your motion, which is forwards. If you are moving to the left, air resistance will be to the right. If you are moving to the right, air resistance will be in the direction left. And there are several factors that can affect air resistance. So the thing about air resistance is when you are moving through air, especially when you are moving quickly, you can really feel the air resistance. And air resistance, because it's a force that opposes your motion, in other words, it's a force that acts against you, it pushes against you, it will slow you down. So Let's say you want your car to move very quickly, you need to know what are the ways that you can do in order to limit air resistance or in order to have a small air resistance so that you can move through very quickly. So these are the factors that affects air resistance. Number one, the speed. If you are, the faster you go, the more air resistance that you will feel. Okay, so that's the first factor. The second factor is the surface area of an object. The larger the surface area of an object moving through air, the more air resistance it will feel. For example, so here I have two objects drawn. Okay, let's say you have a big piece of paper and you have a small piece of paper, and then you drop these two things from a certain height. What will happen is that, like I said, surface area affects air resistance. So the big paper, because it has a larger area than the small paper, that means the big paper will experience a lot more air resistance. So it will have a larger surface area for the air particles to exert force on. So it has a larger air resistance. Whereas the small paper, it will have, because it has a smaller surface area, so the air resistance acting on the small paper will also be small. The third factor is the shape of the object. Some objects can cut through air quite easily. For example, like this diamond-shaped object here or the circle-shaped object here. If it can cut through air quite easily, then it will experience less air resistance. So I can show you what it looks like. So for this cuboid here, it doesn't cut through the air quite easily, so it will experience a larger air resistance. In other words, it's harder for the air to flow around the object. For the circle, it's a little bit more easier because it's a smooth shape. It has smooth curves, and therefore it's easy for the air particles to move around the object. And it's even more easier for this diamond-shaped object because it can cut through the air quite easily, and the air can easily go around the object. Okay, so the shape also will affect the air resistance. Another word for this effect is called aerodynamics, and you probably have heard of this word before. Okay, aerodynamics, in other words, how the air moves around the object. So aero is the word for air. Dynamics is the movement of air. So how does air move around the object? And the last factor affecting air resistance is the density of air. So if there is a lot of air in the atmosphere, it'll be harder to move in, and there will be a lot of uh, there, there will be a lot of air resistance because there are a lot of because you have a denser air, so there are a lot of air particles. If you have less dense air, then there will be less air particles around you, and therefore you can move through it, and there will be not a lot of air particles hitting your body, and therefore you have less air resistance. Okay, so connecting back this lesson to the previous lesson, so how does air resistance affect free fall? Falling objects on Earth experiences air resistance, so because the Earth has air around it, it has an atmosphere, and therefore objects on Earth will experience air resistance when it is falling. And air resistance is the only reason why objects falling from the same height don't fall at the same time. The mass of the object has nothing to do with it. For example, dropping a ball and a sheet of paper, the paper falls to the ground last because it has a larger surface area and hence it experiences a larger air resistance. The air resistance causes the paper to have a lower rate of acceleration. If there is no air resistance, objects falling at the same height will reach the ground at the same time, regardless of their mass. Right, so let me explain. Okay, so for example, let's say you have a ball and a piece of paper. They are dropped from a certain height, and they are being pulled by gravity, which are these blue arrows here. This is the gravitational force, and they're pulling these two down. If you don't have an atmosphere or don't have air, and only gravity is acting on these two objects, they will fall and then reach the ground at the same time. So that is what should happen. But because if you drop these two things on Earth, and because Earth has an atmosphere, what will happen is the ball will drop first, and then the paper will after that will reach the ground. Why is that? Okay, the reason why that is because of air resistance. So the ball has a smaller air resistance because it has a smaller surface area. So it has a smaller surface area. In other words, this area here, this is the area here that is um, in contact with the air. It has a smaller area when compared to the paper. So the paper has a larger surface area in contact with the air as it is falling down. Okay, and the paper will have, because of its surface area, the paper will have a larger air resistance. And because of that, because the ball doesn't experience a large air resistance, so the ball will have less acceleration when it is falling. Sorry, I mean more acceleration for the ball, and then for the paper, there will be less acceleration when it is falling, right? So you should have watched the video last week that I shared with you. And in the video, it explains further. And also it shows you what happens when two objects fall in vacuum where there's no air, and when two objects fall when there is air. Okay, so please watch that video. And that is pretty much it for this lesson. Thank you for watching. And I'll post again another video next week. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you next week.